Hello and welcome back to the ITK podcast. My name is Ichaji Prime. Kai unfortunately will not be joining us this week. He's a bit busy, so he wasn't able to make it, but hopefully he'll be here for next week's podcast. Now we have a lot to talk about this week. We're going to be talking about Brexit. We're going to be talking about immigration and Michael Jackson. So let's start off with the news, and we're kicking things off in Germany. Now, there was a shooting in a German cinema. An armed masked man was shot dead by German special officers after going into a cinema and taking a number of hostages. Although there were no casualties in this attack, a few of these hostages were injured. Now, this happened at about 3 p.m. local time at a cinema which was showing the Jungle Book, Alice in Wonderland, and Central Intelligence, Kevin Hart's new movie. And according to reports from German media, the man was wearing combat boots and had a long weapon with a munition belt slung over his shoulder. And he fired several shots as he entered the cinema. He took a number of hostages, about 17 hostages. There were a number of media reports that claimed about 50 people were injured in this incident. Now, the motive of this individual is unclear. Police are saying this is a confused individual, but there's no ties to terrorism. There's not much information surrounding the individual himself or why he carried out this attack or what his motive was, as I said before. But it's interesting how if this was a Muslim or someone of, Arab descent, it would have immediately been termed as terrorism. Whereas with any other individual who is of a Caucasian race, it would maybe be said that the person is mentally unstable or in this case is confused. Hopefully in the coming days, there will be more information regarding this situation. So moving on to American politics, Donald Trump never really ceases to amaze people. He's never not in the news. This week, reports are coming out that he's actually taking money from his campaign to fund himself and his business. He's running most of his campaign within his own hotels and conference centers and whatever, and is essentially paying himself off with his own campaign money. And he's also paying his kids to campaign for him. And while we're on the topic of campaign finance, he's being destroyed by Hillary Clinton, who's making up to 30 times what he's making. And so far he's raised about just $1.3 million this month, and Hillary Clinton has raised over 40 million. He has very few staff. He has about 70 staff in comparison to Hillary Clinton's 683 staff. He's not really advertising as much, and there's a lot of worry within the Republican camp that he will not be able to sustain not just the momentum, but he's not spending as much as he should be in comparison to Secretary Clinton. Now, what is important to note is that though many within the establishment and the mainstream are seeing this as a negative for Donald Trump, he actually possibly sees this as a positive for himself, as he can use the argument that he is the underdog, he's spending less money, he's not as bought as Hillary Clinton is, that she has this huge support from the establishment and whatnot, and they're trying to essentially buy their way to the White House. He is here funding himself, and all this rhetoric that he keeps spewing over and over again, it does really attract some sort of sentiments towards him. There are people who are frustrated, definitely people who are frustrated with the establishment and establishment politics, and this could actually work towards his advantage. Now, with that being said, the way he is running his campaign is weird, to say the least. He's not running advertisements on. He's not even running advertisements at all on the televisions in swing states and so on and so forth. He's essentially running his social media himself via Twitter, and not just that, but also he has very little. He doesn't have much manpower. This is someone who didn't even know what a ground game was going into Iowa. Like I said, in comparison to Hillary Clinton, who has about 683 campaign staff, he only has about 70. So really, he's running a very lean campaign. He's not experienced, I would say, in politics or in campaign politics, and the way he's running it is worrisome. However, I do believe that he will always find a way to wind himself out of it and spin it as a benefit for himself. So that will be interesting to note how he copes with raising less money than Hillary Clinton and what his plans are in the long run. So moving on to immigration. Now, a major blow has been dealt to Obama's immigration reform. Now, for those of you who are unaware, Obama introduced an deferred action through executive command. Now, what is deferred action? Basically, it's a policy. Its full name is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and basically this policy enables certain people who arrived in the United States as children and have met certain guidelines to be deferred action for a period of 2 years, and it's subject to renewal. So what does this mean? Basically, it prevents the deportation of not just the children but also the families of these children, and it also prevents the deportation of families who arrived in the United States illegally, had children there who are by effect American citizens, from being deported back to their home countries. Mainly the main country being Mexico, and this has prevented over 11 million undocumented immigrants from being deported back to their respective countries. And he implemented this through executive action, and essentially like about 25 states sued him, and this went to the Supreme Court. Now, it's faced a deadlock in the Supreme Court. It's 4-4. Basically, you're meant to have 9 Supreme Court judges, but because Antonin Scalia died, there are 8 Supreme Court justices, and you have liberal Supreme Court justices, and you have more conservative Supreme Court justices, and it's meant to balance itself out, essentially. So now that it's tied at 4-4, the ruling of the lower courts takes effect, and essentially this deferred action is no longer in place, so to speak. So with the tying up of the Supreme Court ruling, he's not able to, the deferred action cannot take place. So this just highlights the importance of having a Supreme Court nominee being approved by the Senate. Those of you who are following those of you who follow this closely would know that the Republicans have refused to clear any nominees for the Supreme Court, and so this whole thing is just it's just really sad, because there are a number of families who stand to benefit from deferred action who are being placed in limbo, who will face a certain level of uncertainty because they don't know what they could be deported at any moment now. So really, there's no saying what is going to happen now, and we'll keep you guys up to date with whatever happens moving forward. So we'll be talking about Venezuela. So Venezuela is facing a very serious economic crisis due to the drastic drop of oil prices. Inflation rate is at 482%. Unemployment is expected to rise to 30%, and it's even facing negative growth at -8%. So what exactly caused this? basically it was the drop in oil prices. Venezuela is an oil reliant country, and now that the prices have gone up, food stocks have gone up, there's been a lot of looting, a state of emergency has been declared, and now food is being rationed. You have people queuing their long queues for food. People are sleeping overnight just to get basic food stuff such as rice and cooking oil. There's hunger there, and when people are hungry, there's going to be civil unrest. And even though the current government is being run by Nicolas Maduro, many people are blaming the strong-handedness of Hugo Chavez, the former president, who handed over to Nicolas Maduro, for essentially putting Venezuela in this position of not being able to cope with the dwindling prices of oil. Now, coming myself from an oil-rich country, Nigeria, it's sad to see. I'm actually even though I don't take joy in the misfortunes of others, I'm actually quite happy that Nigeria isn't facing something as serious as this. However, it is it is a humbling and a wake-up call to countries who rely essentially on one type of resource for their economic development or for running their country. Things like this can happen. Now you have a situation whereby the government is trying to sell off gold in order to fund itself, and is printing more money and increasing inflation in the process. So basically, the Venezuelan authorities are blaming the United States and right-wing businesses for causing this, for essentially sabotaging the economy, whereas economic analysts are saying that it's because of the way in which private entities or private corporations were nationalized, and because they were not deemed to be working in public interest, and essentially the way that the Venezuelan government has handled the public finances has made it a high-risk debtor, causing the country to not be able to have access to international capital. So there's a lot of civil unrest. There's a petition out for a recall referendum, essentially asking the president to step down. About 1.3 million people have signed the petition, and only 200,000 are required by law. However, it is important to understand that the Electoral Commission is being run by the government itself, so there's a lot of skepticism as to what effect this referendum will actually have, whether it will be able to cause the president to step down, or what might happen next. But as I said, there's a state of emergency, there's civil unrest, people are hungry, and it's just a sad thing to witness. So now, going back to Brexit, earlier we had told you guys about Brexit. So essentially, Brexit was the referendum called into play by the Prime Minister David Cameron to essentially, a referendum is whereby you put up a topic or a question up for vote by the general public, and it's usually a yes or no, or in this case a leave or remain. So Britain was voting on whether to leave or remain within the EU, and the results are in, and Britain has voted to withdraw or leave the European Union. Now, in the wake of this, the British Prime Minister David Cameron has announced that he will be stepping down by October, as he feels that he cannot be able to man this ship. Now, a bit of background. This referendum was actually called into play by David Cameron himself. Britain had always faced this problem of whether or not to stay in the EU since it joined the EU. And David Cameron had seen this as a way for him to finally kill off the question and gain right-wing support because of the growth of parties such as UKIP and backbenchers within the British Parliament. However, this plan, which he was confident in, and a lot of analysts have said he was a bit too overconfident, feeling that he was going to win, feeling that his Remain vision, or can I say that? Remain vision, feeling that most of the citizens of Britain would vote to remain in the EU. However, that is not the case, and I think the final tally was about 51% of people voting to leave the EU. I'll just pull that. I think it was about 51% voting to leave the EU. Now, in the wake of this, the British pound sterling is dropping at an alarming rate. I never in my wildest imagination would have thought that, the pound would have fallen to at such a drastic pace. This is the lowest it's been since 1985, over 35 or 40 years. At the time of recording this, one British pound is equivalent to $1.37. And yeah, it's just crazy right now, because this has repercussions for not just Britain or the EU, but also the world at large. You're seeing the global economy, all the major stock exchanges are opening at a loss, are opening in the red. Currencies are losing their value. The Australian dollar, the British pound, even the euro itself is losing its value gradually. And so what happens next? That's the main question now. Well, in order for the Britain to leave, it needs to invoke Article 50. Now, what is Article 50 of the European Commission, which essentially begins the bureaucratic process of a nation withdrawing from the EU, and there's a time span of about 2 years. Now, David Cameron in his address had said that he would not invoke Article 50. He'd leave that for the new Prime Minister to come in and invoke that himself. So, at least for now, it's not like they've voted on the referendum in the EU and Britain essentially pulls out immediately. But Article 50, once it's invoked, Britain will now consult with the European Union on the terms, because essentially being in the EU enables freedom of movement, freedom of goods and services, so there are no tariffs or things of that nature. But now they will need to discuss or make arrangements for the tariffs that will be in place between the EU, member states within the EU, and Britain itself, and how they're going to tackle various other issues and all the nitty-gritty that entails within the EU and being a member and pulling out. So that's one aspect. So you have the economic aspect with the value of the pound sterling dropping. Now, this is just the short term. This is just day one. We don't know what's going to happen a year, 2 years, 5, 10 years. It's really hard to say. There's a lot of speculation that this could actually tank the British economy and send them into recession. It could have wider repercussions for the EU, because a number of countries are now, or a number of parties within countries are agitating for a similar referendum. I believe Holland is having a referendum next month. Parties in Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Italy, and even France are calling for referendums in their own country. The French National Party is calling for a referendum. Even Italy. So not just did Britain didn't just leave the EU, it possibly could have destroyed the European Union if countries like France and Denmark and Italy decide to pull out of the EU. Like, this could essentially gradually cause the EU to disintegrate within itself. Now, something that I found interesting is that in the West, it seems like the right-wing parties are gaining momentum. You have the National Party in France. You have UKIP in in Britain, and it's actually because of the momentum that UKIP had gained that caused David Cameron to call for a referendum if he did indeed win the election. So you notice that all these nationalistic right-wing parties gaining all this momentum, and then you look at America, which has Donald Trump on the rise, and it's really worrying. Why is there so much fear, or so much fear-mongering from the right wing, and why is it gaining so much sympathy? Because we've seen this, and many people keep elaborating on the fact that we've seen this with leaders such as Hitler, who was pandering to that nationalistic sentiment, and blaming a group of people, whether in this situation they're blaming migrants and refugees, in that situation it was blaming the Jews. So the West is really moving more and more towards the right. A lot of people are saying, British make fun of the Americans for allowing Donald Trump to rise, and look at what is happening. Another interesting thing, looking at the demographics, most of the people who voted for Leave were above the ages of about, I think, 35. Let me just double check, because I don't want to give something that isn't. Okay, so looking at the final result, you had 51.9% of voters voting for Leave, and 48.1% voting for Remain. And you look at how it's spread among the countries. So you had in England 53.2% voting Leave. In Scotland, an overwhelming majority voted to Remain, about 62%. 48.3% in Wales voted to Remain. 55.7% voted to Remain in Northern Ireland. Looking at the demographic spread, it's interesting to note that, so looking at the demographics, you also notice that most of the older people voted for Leave, whereas those who were younger voted for Remain. And it's sad, because most of the people who voted now, most of the older voters voted for Leave, whereas they will not suffer the consequences of that vote. Most of the people who voted for Remain will face the long-term consequences, good or bad, and a lot of people are forecasting that leaving the EU was definitely worse for the Britain, sorry. And yeah, so according to the demographics and the basic breakdown of the vote, the higher the level of education, the higher the EU support. They're saying that the support for Leave basically overlap with support for UKIP. Like, as I said earlier, UKIP is a right-wing party which has gained a lot of momentum, talking about migrants and how they're taking away all their jobs and this, that, and the third. But interestingly, the leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage, who had promised that the money being spent on the EU would be spent on health insurance, has now come back and said that it was a mistake on UKIP's part and they probably shouldn't have done that. So he's already flip-flopping, and this hasn't even lasted a day. So yeah, there's global repercussions within Britain now. There's going to be a new Prime Minister. Many people are speculating that it's going to be Boris Johnson, the former Mayor of London, who's going to take over possibly. He's in the same party as David Cameron, and oppose David Cameron's stance on the issue by saying that Britain did in fact have more to gain by leaving the EU. So that he's possibly the new PM. A number of countries could possibly leave the EU and follow Britain's lead. And there's panic in the global economy, there's panic in the global economy and so on. Scotland will also have a second referendum, because I think because they had said that if indeed they were forcibly removed from the EU, they would have another referendum. So they will have another referendum to vote on whether they should remain within Britain or leave Britain. So not only and it's likely that they do leave Britain, because they voted overwhelmingly to remain within the EU. So yeah, there is so much that has happened just within day one, and there's possibly so much that could happen in the medium to long term. And I feel like June 23rd will be a very historic day. We're going to be talking about this and looking back at the mistake that was made, primarily because to me, it looked like it was a political gamble that didn't go exactly right, and it has caused a prime minister to resign. It's possibly caused the breaking up of Britain, possibly even the breaking up of EU. And this actually, to me, seems like it would add fuel to Donald Trump's campaign, because he has even come out to tweet that everybody has the right to self-determination, blah, blah, blah. He's going to find some way to spin it like, look at Britain, they left the EU because of all the migrants, blah, 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 and we should do the same here, say no to all these Muslim migrants and so on. So while we're on the topic of migration, so as I said earlier, the right wing is gaining a lot of momentum within the West. In Western countries, the right wing is gaining a lot of momentum, and a driving factor of that is indeed migration. And you have not just illegal migration, but also asylum seeking and refugees and so on. So there's this growing phobia of migration. There's this, misplaced worry, I would say, that migrants are coming in to take jobs. But in all honesty, these refugees or migrants are taking jobs that the locals normally wouldn't take. No local would want to work as a bathroom cleaner or a cleaner in general. No no fucking local is coming in and thinking, oh, I'm gonna go work in an old person's home. Migrants, when they come to these countries, have nothing. They have no basis to start, which is why they take any job. These are people who have families and themselves to feed. So even a couple of weeks ago, and we didn't talk about this last week because we forgot, there were two students who were two valedictorian students. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, valedictorian, I think, is like the highest scoring high school student who gives a big speech at like a graduation or whatever. So two of them had come out and said, yeah, they are undocumented immigrants, but now they're going to get scholarships. And they received a ton of backlash, a ton of hate, like, oh, you've done well and it's time for you to go back to Mexico. And for me, not just with America, but Britain, I find this hugely ironic. Britain is a country which essentially was able to rise to power because it went into other countries, occupied them, established them as their own territories in a very unjust way, exported millions of people as slaves, had free labor, free access to resources, which they didn't pay a penny for and still don't pay a penny for. And you have many of these countries still paying taxes back. And these are the same countries who have such malicious anger towards migrants, whereas these countries profited the most from migration. If, in fact, many would argue illegal migration. America is essentially a country of migrants. No matter how much we try and spin it, nobody who's in America currently isn't a migrant. Whether you're black, white, or Hispanic, although Hispanic might have a bit of Native American in them. And even though people say, oh, Native Americans migrated there, yeah, but they were kind of like the first people there. So America is essentially a country of migrants. Everybody who's there is a migrant. So for you to suddenly say, oh, we're going to shut out anybody who doesn't look like us or is from a different country, is weird, because you gain the most from migrants. Without migration, America wouldn't be the great country that it is. You wouldn't have people like Einstein or Tesla or Steve Jobs. Even though Steve Jobs was born there, his father was a migrant. You wouldn't have the atomic bomb, because these were essentially Austrian physicists and so on, and scientists who came into America and developed the atomic bomb in America. You wouldn't have a lot of these technological advancements, and America wouldn't be as great as it is now if it wasn't for migrants, whether they came there illegally or legally. And there are some who have gone there illegally and have done great things. Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer, he was an illegal migrant. Salma Hayek, these are illegal migrants. And while you do face the risk of having some people doing something wrong, it's inevitable. Because even within the citizenry of Americans, people who have been there for generations, whose families have been there since America was established, there's still some that commit crime. Crime is not exclusive to a group of people. It happens because we're all different. You can't say because, oh, he's black, he's more likely to commit crime. Or, oh, because, to me, it's probably a product of his environment. Or he's just doesn't give a fuck. So, this whole phobia of migration and migrants, I feel is unfounded. I feel it's baseless, because we are all migrants if we really get down to the point. Especially places like America and Britain, which have profited the most from migration. So without migration, these countries essentially wouldn't be as great as they are now if they didn't have the free labor or the free resources, or even these people who have come into these countries. Because you have to understand, these migrants aren't going to your country because they want to fuck it up. They're going there because they don't have a choice. Living in Kenya, I came into contact with a lot of Somali refugees, and though they were in a bad situation, most of them, their thinking was, okay, when I have enough money or when things get better, the plan is to go back home. Most of these refugees wouldn't be in your country or in these countries if the situation back home was good. And we're so afraid of globalism, whereas globalism is already here. You can't be isolated. We all influence each other, and we're all one big community. So this phobia again towards refugees, to me, is baseless, because refugees have nothing. They're going into these countries because they don't have any other choice. That's one. Two, they just want to work and earn a living and earn a life, a better life for their families. It's not like they decided for their country to be at war or for them to be persecuted. They didn't make that choice consciously, but for whatever reasons, political, racial, ethnical, or whatever, they're in that situation where they need to leave their countries. And if, some of them do go there and they do fuck up and they do gain privileges and benefits, but at the same time, some of them do well and impact the society in such a way that it makes it better in the long run. And some migrants actually pay a lot more than what the locals pay. As a student, I pay 3 times what locals pay in terms of university tuition. I don't go around complaining about how it's unfair because as a migrant I pay more. And then there's some refugees who come here and they don't pay anything and they're funded by the government. But that's not what's important here. What's important is how we help one another, because we're all human at the end of the day. And yes, this might sound like idealistic, preaching or, rosy, rosy peace sign in the air talk. Yeah, it does sound corny, but it's the truth. We are all one race. We are all humans at the end of the day. And the moment we lose empathy towards one another is the moment we stop being human. These people are not out here to kill you or to destroy you. They're out there to make a better life for themselves. They don't really care about, stealing your job, because you weren't going to take that job anyways. What they care about is earning an honest living for their families and just living a comfortable life. Everybody deserves to have a comfortable life. And if the least you could do is to open your doors to them, then just do that. Because you would want someone to do that for you in that situation. They didn't choose to be born into conflict. Nobody makes that choice where they're born into. So for us to be so prejudiced and to be so, have such a great phobia towards migration and refugees and so on, is just really sad. We need to work with one another and understand that we are all one large community at the end of the day. So that's really, I think I'm going to stop there on migration, because I don't want to sound too preachy, because if it goes on for longer, I might sound like, I'm trying to preach on a Sunday morning or anything. But yeah, so 25th, this weekend will mark 7 years since the world lost arguably the most iconic musical artist by the name of Michael Jackson. Someone who has, you could say, touched the lives of everybody in the world in some way or another. I would even go as far as saying that Michael Jackson could possibly be more famous than Jesus now. I know a lot of people will be like, oh, that's blasphemous, but think about it. Everybody has heard of Michael Jackson in some way, whether you're in fucking Japan or you're in some remote location in Africa. Everybody knows who Michael Jackson is. Everybody knows what Thriller is. So you could say that dude is like the most popular human being ever. So now, in preparation or leading up to this, so we're going to move on to Michael Jackson now. This weekend will mark 7 years since the King of Pop passed away. A bit of overshadowing though. Earlier this week, Rap Radar released about an 88-page long police report, in which the report details that photos of children were found in Jackson's estate, but are not classified as child pornography. So a bit of background: when the police raided Jackson's Neverland Ranch in 2003, a number of documents, photographs, boxes were seized, and among those there were pictures, according to this report, that had naked children in them and semi-dressed children. Now, although these are indeed naked children, they are not legally classified as childhood pornography, though the police were saying that this could be used to groom the children into feeling that, it's normal, and then get them to, be comfortable with engaging in whether sexual intercourse or getting touched or whatever. So this police report was used in the investigation and the trial. The evidence here was presented in the trial, but as I said earlier, it's not classified as childhood pornography. Now, for me personally, the moment when this report was released, well, it wasn't released, it was Rap Radar that sort of brought it to light, and the Santa Barbara police have indeed confirmed the authenticity of this report. When it came out, it seemed a bit fishy to me, because I was like, this weekend it's going to be 7 years since Michael Jackson passed away. The timing seemed a bit off. So yeah, though the timing seemed off and whatever, so even the Jackson estate has come out to say something similar, like the timing of this seems to want to take away from the significance of whatever memorial, or to cast a shadow of doubt over the integrity of Michael Jackson's character. Me personally, I never believed the allegations that he was a pedophile. Now, I don't know much about pedophilia. Now, I don't know much about pedophilia or pedophiles, but it's like, why would someone go to that much of an effort to rape little boys or little girls or whatever? Build a ranch, have a theme park there, invite kids there for free, and then just fuck them. Like, it's like, it takes effort to do all that. And knowing how famous he was, he must have had in the back of his mind that as famous as he is, people are going to use this to exploit him, or it's going to leak or come out, because this is, you could argue, the most famous person in the world. Like, everybody knows who Michael Jackson is. So the possibility of this getting out and how damaging it could be must have been hanging around his head. That being said, now that even though he was acquitted, the case was like, even though he was acquitted, people still believe that he did do this, and this police report will only serve to cast more doubt as to the character of Michael Jackson. That being said, I still hope this doesn't take away from the memorial of 7 years. Like, it's been a while since we lost Michael Jackson. I've been going through his music this past week, just reflecting and absorbing and appreciating the artistry and the effort that must have gone into his work. A lot of people tried to discredit him and be like, he's not that great of a musician, he couldn't play an instrument. Being a musician isn't always about playing instruments, but also about how you arrange all the instrumentation and the production and the singing in order to give something that's enjoyable. And it's safe to say Michael Jackson's music was overwhelmingly enjoyable. Everybody liked Michael's music. Even so, some people were like, oh, I don't like his personality. Everybody liked the music, everybody enjoyed the music. And Thriller being the highest selling album it was, even he wasn't satisfied with that. He was like, oh, he didn't want to release it, he wanted to throw it out. I think it was Quincy Jones that encouraged him to still release it. And even though Michael was a great talent and he was a musical genius and he was a hard worker, it just goes to show you, when you have good people around you, it takes you to that next level. Someone like Quincy Jones, you could argue, if Quincy Jones hadn't mentored Michael Jackson, he possibly couldn't have been the international or the phenomena that he is now without the help and the mentorship of Quincy Jones. So yeah, go get your Michael Jackson tapes, listen to his music and just, show some appreciation. I think that's the most important thing, because he was an icon and still is an icon, hugely influential. I mean, this is someone who's influenced almost everybody in music who's come out in the past 20 or 30 or so years. He's influenced his contemporaries, he's mentored so many people like Usher, who's mentored also like Chris Brown, The Weeknd. All of these people draw inspiration and draw their style from Michael Jackson. And it's safe to say everybody knows who Michael Jackson is. You could argue he's more famous than Jesus, even though a lot of people will be like, oh, it's blasphemous to say that. But let's be real here. You could argue that people from Japan, like, you have to understand, in Asia they don't really like black people, but people in Japan were like fainting and dying when they saw Michael Jackson. This is someone who was an international star. Not saying he transcended race, because I don't think there's such a thing as transcending race, but he was so popular and so loved by everyone. He made such great music. He was such a phenomenal entertainer. So he really is missed. Me personally, I think he's still here with us, listening to his music. His music is so timeless to me. And yeah, so 7 years, go get your Michael tapes. There's gonna be a lot of moonwalking, there's gonna be a lot of dancing and crotch grabbing. So yeah, enjoy that. So finally, I just want to talk briefly on stress again and anger. So a lot of people can't handle anger, and even myself, I don't even know what's the best way to handle anger. Not just anger towards people, but sometimes anger with yourself. Sometimes you can just be so frustrated with where you are in your life or who you are as a person, and sometimes people piss you off and you're just angry with them. But handling anger is important, handling it the right way, because a lot of times you say or do some things, that are irreversible, or you might get into an argument and say something about someone you care about, and it could affect your relationship with that person forever, or you might do something to that person. A lot of people talk about domestic violence. It also has to do with learning how to deal with anger. In society, we don't talk about these things. We don't talk about how we're supposed to deal with depression and how we're supposed to deal with anger. Now, while these things are individual based or are vary from person to person, it is important that we discuss them, because when you open dialogue to something, you take away the taboo, you take away the shyness about it. When something is openly discussed, it really draws away from, it really makes it more normal, I guess, because the reason why sex is seen as a big taboo is that we don't talk about sex. If people talk about sex, they're like whispering really close and they're like, oh, is someone hearing, or it's in a private thing. But if we talk about things like anger, depression, hatred, if we talk about them more openly, I honestly feel like the world would be in a better place. Now, why specifically anger? Well, you see all these people who get frustrated or angry and then just pick up guns and go and kill people indiscriminately. Like this week, I got so angry and I did something which scared someone I care about, or someone else can be, hit someone and they don't intend to do that, or because we can't control our emotions. Now, emotions are an important part of us being human. Sometimes we don't handle them well, sometimes we do handle them exceptionally well. For me, when I'm angry, especially when I'm angry with someone in specific, I avoid contact with that person for maybe 5-10 minutes and just let that anger subside. Now, David So, who's a YouTuber, he said something interesting, is like, if as a man, if you're angry, even as a woman, if you're angry, just masturbate, because it's true, at least from my experience. Like, you can't jerk off and be angry. You jerk off, you come and you're like happy. So that's one thing you could possibly do, masturbate, and just, in that moment you can be happy. Now, obviously, you're not going to have a chance to masturbate if you're in public. This is something like if you're in private, touch yourself a little bit, get yourself, orgasm, and then, cool down a bit. But on a serious note, when I find myself angry, I just withdraw myself from that situation and I mute myself. Now, why do I mute myself? Because, like I said, when you're angry, you say things. And these things you say, they are tinged in some level of honesty. Usually when you're angry, you remove restraint from yourself. You're not restrained in your behavior, in your actions, or in your thoughts. You're unhinged. So whatever you're saying, there is no filter. Whatever you're doing, there is no restraint in your actions. So with anger, I think the best way to do it is to remove yourself from the situation. One, to mute yourself. So don't say anything, just calm yourself or take yourself to a place where you don't have to really comment or engage the person who you're being angry with. And also, a big part of being angry is angering someone. And sometimes we as humans like to push buttons, and we push the buttons a bit too far. Like, you can tell when someone is annoyed at you and you think it's funny to keep pissing them off, and then the person just snaps, So yeah, I just wanted to talk briefly on anger. This week's podcast doesn't run as long, I guess, because like I said, Kai isn't here, and I feel it's always better when you have Kai here because there's like a discussion. But yeah, hopefully he'll be here next week. Sorry if it was a bit short. Sorry if it was a little bit more on the boring side, not much of a conversation going on. But I do hope you learned something, about Brexit. Brexit is important, and I feel like we'll be talking about it down the line as the weeks go on. So, yeah, I guess that's all I have for this week. My name is Dijaji Prime, and I'll see you guys next week, hopefully with Kai back on. And yeah, hope you have a blessed day, hope you enjoyed listening, and hope you have a blessed week ahead of you. Goodbye.